Welcome. This is Money Heart, where we explore the emotional side of money. I'm Camille Diaz, and today we're discussing negotiating your salary. My guest is Iris Culp. She's a leadership and career coach. Iris, welcome to Money Heart.
Thank you, Camille. I'm so pleased to be here.
Very glad to have you here. So, as a career coach, when people come to you to talk about salary, what are the most common aspects that they're frustrated with and really want to discuss?
Well, often it is not being certain how to wade into that discussion, if you will, with a potential employer. And if they should be bringing it up or how that's going to start. So what typically happens is that the employer brings it up, and it's happening earlier in discussions nowadays than I saw it happen, say, 8-10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
There's a focus just in the interviewing and recruiting process to make sure no one's wasting anybody's time. And I think that's one of the driving factors.
Gotcha.
But that can put an individual in a search in an awkward position kind of early on.
Mm-hmm.
So it's usually just like, what's okay to say, what's not okay to say, kind of where to start. And just, it feels like a little bit like quicksand, right? Because they don't want to like jump in with a number and then be wrong and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there's usually a lot of stress about that. And there really doesn't need to be. I tend to suggest a really straightforward kind of approach, which is if you get asked, so what is your salary expectation? I totally give people permission to answer that question with a question.
Nice.
And we're kind of conditioned, especially in that kind of a situation. Oh, they're asking these questions. You know, it's an interview. I've got to answer every question. No, stop. You don't need to answer that question.
I love it. You don't have to answer that question. This is perfect.
Exactly. So I tend to say every employer has a salary range. Okay. Mm-hmm. They have one and they know it. I don't care if it's a Fortune 500. Certainly they have a lot of compensation people who sit around in offices all day long and figure out the ranges. If it's a mom and pop store or whatever, small organization, they have a range. You know, they don't go to market to hire talent without having thought about that. So instead of trying to, I make the analogy, put blindfold over your eyes and try to hit the target, you know, the little bullseye, just say, oh, well, as long as I'm paid market competitive and this and this and this really interests me about the job, you know, what's important to me is be consistent and competitive in the marketplace. What your range is. And that's kind of the toss back.
Yeah. So
99% of the time, they're going to tell you what their range is. And then you're not blindfolded trying to shoot a dart in a tiny space.
Right. Yeah. I really like that. So to make sure that I got it, because that's a big deal, it's saying, well, I'm sure that I'd be happy with whatever your range is as long as it's competitive in the marketplace. So you're kind of going, I hope you're offering something that's reasonable.
Right. And it kind of communicates, because no employer is going to say, oh, no, we pay less than the market. Right? They're not going to say that. I mean, I guess you're applying a little bit of pressure. I mean, part of why I suggest you say that is you express, hey, I have value in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Compliment them or potentially compliment that I'm sure your range is there. You know, and it also kind of facilitates the bigger question, which is, are we going to be compatible?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, then it also says you've done your research. Like, well, hey, I know what this job runs.
Right. And I specifically, if you're putting a resume in or you're having this conversation, I suggest doing doing your research. And so when you say that question, you already have at least 3 data points of information to work from. One of them is the research you do on market, which is I tend to prefer salary.com. I know a lot of people go to Glassdoor, but for some technical reasons, salary.com is a little bit more reliable around who reports, and it's less, anyway. So there's some of that. Adecco, I have access to their salary reports, which are extremely comprehensive. And then your past salary. And your past salary would be 1 point among at least 3. Then you can be more objective about where you were and kind of take all those things into account. So, doing a little bit of research before you get into a conversation can be highly empowering, because without that, one tends to feel in approaching this first conversation like, well, I don't want to ask too much, but I say a number, then I'm going to undersell myself. And that's a very valid concern.
Right.
And if they press you and say, well, our range is here to here, and they share the range, then you already know kind of where things are at, because you've done that other work. And then perhaps it's like a little bit low, or it's way higher than you expected. Then it's kind of gravy train. You're like, well, that sounds like it's within my target. Or if it's super low, say, well, the top of that range sounds workable. I mean, it just gives you a lot of movement instead of being locked. And that's one thing. You don't want to be locked into any negotiation experience, of course. And yeah, you're not negotiating, but it is kind of a level set of expectation that has to happen in that initial piece. So people are usually most concerned about how that conversation is going to start out.
Right. What happens if someone's salary at a previous job was low and they knew it was low and they're trying to move up, but they're scared that the new employer is going to want to pay them only slightly above what they made before?
Right. So great question, because some employers some states are not allowing employers to even ask that question. Okay? Yeah. For a whole host of reasons that I won't bore you with. But if someone's like, well, but shouldn't I tell them? No. And the other thing I like to point out, and this is an analogy I often make. So if a roofer comes to my house and says, hey, I did your neighbor's roof and I charged them X, Y, I'll do yours for the exact same price. We wouldn't expect that. That's illogical, right? A different roof with different situations. So my former employer, maybe they were underpaying me. So why would I give that information to a future employer? Because they may choose to use that in a way to, you might say, undersell or underprice things. I don't often see that happen. I'm not going to say it doesn't. I'm not that naive, but I've been around the block.
Been once or twice, right? Yeah, not your first day. I understand.
Yeah.
Love it. What about people who are coming back to the job market after being unemployed, or maybe they took a break to have a family and now they're wanting to re-enter? What kind of things do you teach them or coach them on for salary negotiation? Because I mean, what they were making, even though it might have been at top of the market 5 or 6 years ago, may not be that currently.
Right. And this is where I'm passionate not to let people kind of undersell their skills. So part of it goes into, you might say, even some of that pre-work of making sure their resume and their LinkedIn is really positioning their skills properly. And that's kind of a whole separate conversation. But in terms of the salary piece, my advice just on that piece in their search would be do the same thing. You might have to leave your past salary as kind of a smaller point, in your collection of information, and really focus heavily on, what things are paying. And some employers will publish it within a posting. Most don't, but some do. And there are quite a few different places where you can collect data. You just have to do a little bit of digging. And then again, industry is going to affect that. There's going to be really a number of factors. Probably the biggest thing to keep in mind too, in terms of salary, and I know this show is Money Heart, and that's why I was really excited when you shared about, because the salary piece is such an emotional side of money. And I see it all the time. Because you think, well, just human nature. Well, what I get paid is, what I'm worth. And yes, it is. And no, it isn't. What you get paid is really a reflection of three things: the industry you're in, the scarcity of the skill set, and your geography. So it's really those, you might say, three factors that all play into it. Because more obviously, the scarcer your skill is, that's just something we all know. So skill scarcity, there's the skills, and then underneath that, it's the scarcity of the skill. And then it's the industry you're in. So some industries have a huge margin, right? For example, oil and gas, which, it has peaks and valleys, but they tend to really, and even the compensation people in those organizations and in those industries take a lot of pride in paying in the 95th, 97th percentile, et cetera.
Okay, I'm going to pause you really quick because I want our listeners and viewers to really know what percentile means, because sometimes we throw that number out for test scores and percentages and all this kind of stuff, and not everybody is a statistics whiz. And so tell me if I have this right, if someone's paying in the 90th percentile, that means the salary package at that job is higher than 90% of the salary packages from the same job for other companies. Am I getting that?
That is absolutely correct.
Okay, cool. All right. So now we know what 90th or 95th percentile means. So oil and gas tends to pay like that.
It tends to be in that 90th or above. Now, the trade-off is they're very cyclical, right? So ups and downs. Other spectrum, I have spoken with some people who are like, oh my gosh, I just want stability. Well, that it's somewhat elusive, but probably the most stable thing you can do is present yourself well on LinkedIn all the way going forward, because your own personal brand is really what gives you stability in your network. But in terms of industry and stability, that really goes around those type of organizations that don't pay well: educational institutions, utilities, things that have very little volatility in their industry. Sometimes people will say, oh my gosh. In fact, I think I was sharing with you earlier, someone I was working with had left an oil and gas company, and they were like, I want to go work at this university. And chatted with this individual post-interview at the university, and she was so stunned at the salary range at the university. She said, I laughed. And I said, I hope it wasn't very loud.
Yeah.
But she had worked at this oil and gas company her whole life and just had never really had the occasion, because it sounds like, oh, it would be a wonderful, or, sometimes we have perceptions of certain industries as being the perfect place.
Yeah.
And the work was a little different as well, but it was roughly 4 times what she had, or 4 times less. I'm not a guru on that, but what it was 200% less than her former salary.
Wow.
Right.
So I guess rough numbers, was she making 6 figures?
Yes, a bit over 6 figures, and then this one was more in the 30s.
In the 30,000 a year range.
She shared that with me, and I just said, actually, for that role inside of a university, that's pretty decent money. And so anyway, it's just to say it's not a reflection of really our value. It's a reflection of these things, right? Industry, skills, and then to some degree geography. Of course, we all know that geography is a big indicator.
Right.
Yeah. of that. In terms of
And I
cost.
like that point of the stability within that industry. So, oil and gas things go well, everybody gets hired. Oil and gas things go poorly, everybody gets fired or laid off, and that happens every 2 to 5 years. And there are very few people that work at the same company in the same job for more than 3 to 5 years in oil and gas, because every time things go south, they've got to lay everybody off and then they just rehire again later.
Right.
Mhm.
And in the pandemic, I mean, the aviation industry, they hire
Right.
en masse when they hire, and then when they lay off, it's usually en masse.
Yeah.
Right. It's industry is really a significant factor in terms of the salary. So
Mhm.
it's not about you. You know what I mean? It's
Sure.
personal, but it's not personal. So
Right.
that's
It's not
why
personal against you. Yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
is important.
Yeah. And I like that idea, because it's something to know. Hey, if I want to work in this industry where I'm going to get compensated in the 90th percentile for what I'm doing, I might want to be putting half of that back for the day that they lay me off, because I know it's coming.
Exactly. I have worked with, I think, more than one reservoir engineer, and those individuals are highly paid, as they should be, for these very specific skills that make a huge impact on those companies' business or return on investment. And I'm thinking of one individual in the last several months, and he said, "Yeah, no, I have about 2 years worth of savings because I'm in this industry." And then sadly, I've spoken with some other people in that industry who didn't have any, so didn't have any savings. Um, and when this person was interviewing, I'm thinking again, just one particular individual, they were having a hard time getting interviews because they knew the potential employers were like, well, you've come from this organization in town that's in oil and gas, and we know how much they pay, so you're going to be dissatisfied with whatever pay we can afford to give you. So
Mm.
if you do land in one of those, I'll call it gravy train industries for a period of time, like I heard you sharing the other night on one of your shows, which is, it's helpful to put some aside, right?
Yep.
So that's something I see certainly during this time, that, money is a tool, and if we can set some aside, it's always good, regardless of how much we make. And I tell my teenagers, it's not necessarily how much you make, it's how much you live under whatever it is you make.
Right. Yes. Very true. Very true. Always putting some aside. Because even if you have one of those, let's say, more stable industries, you still don't know what's going to happen with your family, what's going to happen with your health, what's going to happen if you get into a car wreck, what's going to happen with the weather. You just never know.
Right.
Yeah.
Earthquakes in Oklahoma, who would have ever thought? Right?
Earthquakes and tornadoes and ice storms and all kinds of things, fires that are happening. You never know what's going to happen outside of the things you can control. So having money on hand never hurts.
Yeah. One of my favorite life phrases, if you will, kind of a mantra that I often joke about, but it's really true. Life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. And
Right.
I think that's one of my favorite little quotes.
Yes.
So anyway, yeah.
I love that. Mm-hmm.
To some, but yeah, it's an objective point of view. So make sure as you're approaching that conversation with potential employer, you're collecting that, so you're armed with that information before the conversation starts.
That's perfect. That's perfect. So I want to talk about a little bit more. You gave us some in the beginning, tough questions that come up typically in interviews, because I'm sure that there are maybe some traps or landmines or whatever you want to call them that interviewers tend to throw out that gives them a lot of information and sort of leaves the interviewee maybe a little bit stuck. How can we do a better job of answering those? And if you want to cover the salary one more time, that'd be okay, because I'm sure all of us are like, wait, what happened? Maybe I have to rewind. So we know we got it.
Yeah, let me touch on probably the big caveat on the salary questions. What were you making at your last employer? And that's usually the big hole to avoid stepping in. Or you just simply say, oh, Well, what I would like to know is what is your range for the position?
Perfect.
Then literally stay silent. Silence in an interview is often golden.
Ah.
And we have a tendency, because of the adrenaline rush that comes with an interview,
Mm-hmm.
the mentality is, I'm now prepared for questions. So again, if you get that salary, tell me what you were making at your former employer. Just take a deep breath, even, and I suggest practicing this even. Well, a lot of things, you get better with practice, and just say, well, this position really interests me. Can you tell me more about the range of the role in terms of the salary range?
Mm-hmm.
I think of the bullseye and your dart and you're blindfolded. So
Mm-hmm.
it helps avoid that question.
Yeah.
And the other things in a very high level in terms of preparing for an interview, lots of times people feel like, oh my gosh, I have to be ready for every question. They really don't. I suggest going in with a very specific, you might say, bullet list of things that you think they ought to understand about your background, so that when the interview is over, you can consider it a success if you got, say, these 5 data points across, or these 5 mini stories. And then that goes into, some other things in terms of how to prepare for an interview.
Mm-hmm.
But, and then the other general tip I have is the one I mentioned earlier about silence. If you get a question and you're not certain really kind of how to tag into it, just feel free to say, let me give that some thought. And then take your 10 seconds. Because the worst thing that you can do is start talking, because then your brain is editing your speech and trying to think of the answer.
Mm-hmm.
People will totally be like, oh, this person's being thoughtful. So if you use that for salary or any other questions, that's probably the big one that is really hard to do because of just the dynamic of an interview.
Mm-hmm. So is a lot of what you do maybe coaching on, one, it sounds like confidence, so that when someone goes in there, they feel like a little more confident, and maybe a little less of the I want to say submissive position of, I'm going in begging and hoping that they will choose me for this job, and much more trying to be on equal footing of, I really have something to offer. Let's see if this job is a fit.
Absolutely. And I have seen interviews, you might say, be made on the questions that the candidate asks of, say, the panel. I'm thinking of several.
Mm-hmm.
So do go in. You absolutely nailed it, Camille. You go in and yes, you have some things you want them to understand, but you have some questions for them that they should be answering. And one thing I'm really passionate about is, if you're searching for a job and you're currently unemployed, don't let that cloud your approach, or your just your approach to interviewing. So I can talk a lot more about that, but that would be a different discussion.
A whole second topic. I love it. I think this has been really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Iris can be found at her website, www.ic-growth.com, and that IC is her initials for Iris Culp, so it's ic-growth.com. And she's also on social media under the same handle, I, the letter I, C, the letter C, and growth. Thank you as well to all of our listeners and viewers. I'm your host, Camille Diaz. This show is sponsored by Serenity Financial of Five Rings Financial Agency, specializing in financial education, living benefits, and guaranteed lifetime income. Iris helps come up with our money mantra for today. Do you want to share that with us, Iris?
You go ahead.
Okay, I will do it. And I really liked your previous one. Can you say that one again too?
The know your worth.
Well, know your worth, yes, is the one for that. And the one you gave us in the middle of your favorite saying.
Oh, life is what happens while you're busy making other plans.
Yes, I think that's a great one to remember. Life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. And our mantra for today is, I know my worth.